A very warm good evening to everyone who's watching this, joining us today yet again for our monthly take on nature writing for children series. My name is Shashwat. I'm part of the research center and the communication team at Azim Premji University. And if you have joined us, again, this is a recurring series that we have this, conversations with different individuals and authors and publishers who have written books primarily targeted towards kids, and especially in the genre of nature and environment consciousness, books that kind of promote that ethos. So yet another addition to that wonderful series, we have today with us Uma, who's an author and an educator. She has been born in India and currently lives in Canada, and through her book she has been raising awareness about South Asian ethos and culture and traits in the Americas, so as to say. So some of her, she has won numerous awards for her different books over the years, well over a decade and so. And some of the books that kind of strike to you is Naming Maya, Chachaji's Cup, The Grand Plan to Fix Everything. My personal favorite is Book Uncle and Me, and the current one that has the sequel to that is Birds on the Brain. So thank you so much, Uma, for joining us today. And it's a pleasure to, have this conversation with you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So just to kick off the discussion, Birds on the Brain is presented as a sequel to Book Uncle and Me. And one of the ways is, of course, the recurring characters that find thing. So I just wanted to, how did you design it as a sequel? Was it designed as a sequel or something that just happen to connect in certain very interesting ways? And also, Book Uncle and Me is around 2012, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
The sequel took so long. Why is that?
Well, because it wasn't intended to be a sequel. I never thought that I would be writing a sequel to Birds on the Brain. I thought I was, to Book Uncle and Me, I thought I was done with that story. But a few years ago, when was it? It was during the pandemic. And everybody was online, and we were doing these, Zoom things with kids. And I did an event for through, I think it was North Vancouver libraries. And it was some kids were in the classroom, some were zooming in from home. There was all these squares of faces all over the screen. And somebody said, well, when we got to the Q&A, one of the kids asked, I think she was in 3rd grade or something, and she said, is there going to be a sequel to Book Uncle and Me? We were talking about Book Uncle and Me. And I said, I don't know, should there be? And then they sort of started talking, and the people chipped in, and they said, maybe there should be 2 because there are 3 kids. And I thought, oh, that's a good idea. So, the way I see it, ideas are cheap. If we went around this audience out there, we would come up with 100 or more great ideas. And the trick is what's going to last, what's going to stick, and what can I bear to live with for the couple of years that it's going to take to write a book. But that one stuck. And I thought, I wouldn't mind going back to the Book Uncle universe and seeing these people again and seeing what I can do with them. So that's really how it happened. And now I wish I had noted that kid's name, because I would have acknowledged her properly in the book. But I just didn't take it seriously at the time. I just thought, oh, well, let's see. So that's how it happened.
Yeah, so as you said, there are 3 characters primarily, Rini, Yasmin, and Anil in that sense, right? Mm-hmm. So can we expect yes, the wonderful book. So I think so now there's a 3rd edition that is also there, right?
There will be next year. It's called The Sunshine Project, and it is Anil's story. So of course there are 3 friends, and each of them is the first person narrator in one of the books, and Anil will have his own story. This is turning out to be a little bit of a challenge because he's sort of a quiet kid. He doesn't say very much. He just communicates through his karate moves. So that was fun and also a challenge.
Fascinating. Before I come to the Birds on the Brain, my as I said, my personal favorite has been Book Uncle and Me. I personally feel it's a fantastic idea. The whole idea, I wish at certain stages we had such book uncles. It would be so wonderful to have them around us. So where did you get this idea? How did it come? If you can just take us to the genesis and the
So,
backstory, so as to say.
like many books, I mean, I think everything comes out of your life, right? I mean, it's really the only thing you have to work with is your own mind. But I can see now the confluences that made this happen. And there were many things. One of them was I was visiting my parents in Chennai at the time. This was before my father passed away in 2010. And I was walking, I don't know, somewhere with a shopping bag, going to run an errand or something. And there was this kid sitting on the pavement, in the middle of the pavement, broken Chennai pavement with, the bricks like this. And she was sitting there and she had a book. She was sitting cross-legged. She had a book in her lap and she was reading. And I thought, oh, there's a story there. I wonder what it is. And there was an election going on at the same time. And just to amuse myself, I thought, okay, well, let me see. Is there a way to put those two things together? And that's how Book Uncle and Me happened. But where did it really come from? I don't know. Maybe it came from an old family friend whom I remember from Delhi in the 1960s. Rao Mama used to teach me how to do, he used to introduce me to books. He would show me, he could do this thing where he would make a rabbit out of a handkerchief and it would jump out at you unexpectedly. He amused me greatly. And I had lovely conversations with him. He wasn't a book uncle, but he was certainly an ideas uncle in my life. And then I've heard about these community libraries where people just, take their own book collections and put them out into the world. And before, this movement has become formalized now, but it has existed in India for decades, right? Because we don't have the kind of public library system that's easily accessible to everybody in every neighborhood. And this is a niche that has been filled over decades by often elderly people, often people who have been teachers or something else in their lives that has had to do with children and stories. They're not always children either. So I think it was those ideas, sort of this intellectual understanding of this, but also these streams in my own life. So I don't think when you're writing, you always know where your stories come from, but I think that is all where Book Uncle came from.
Fascinating. And the reason I think so it's very touching is, as you said, in India we had that culture which is kind of vanishing now. You had these all very bookshops. There was a recent one in Bangalore which shut down, and after very many years, I remember the Strand in Mumbai, and you had these shops where you had the character in the book uncle itself, he's able to, you go to him with a topic or a problem or a challenge, and he fishes out the books from somewhere. And that kind of is missing now in an online kind of a world that we are existing in. So in that sense, this your very idea is very, it reminds you of the past in that ways.
It does. And 10 years ago, it was already vanishing, and now it has vanished even more, which is also, but that need for story is still around. And, in the West, they have these, the Little Free Library movement, which is sort of taking hold. And it would be very interesting to see if that's something that's translatable to other places in the world. It's the same concept, really. You give a book, you take a book.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So coming back to the theme for our discussion today, nature writing as a genre. I wanted your thoughts on it, and what is the kind of, because you are also teaching. You're an educator as yourself. So what importance and what's the relevance that you give to books which are on nature and specifically targeted towards a younger audience?
Yeah, so I'm actually not teaching anymore. I have retired from that part of my life, which gives me more time to do my own writing. But I did teach for 16 years. And the wonderful thing is that now I'm seeing my students' books out in the world, which is really, really nice. It makes me feel a little bit like a midwife. So it's pretty good. But yeah, I think we have become used to thinking of ourselves as sort of separate from the natural world, as consumers of it, I think, in some ways. And we're seeing how we have depleted the natural world around us by that consumer ethos. And to me, it's really important that writers pay attention to whatever around them is of importance to them. And so I always used to tell my students, I'm not going to teach you to write like me. You have to learn to write the way you were meant to write, the way you want to write. So I don't have little tricks and tips that will ensure that your story goes from A to Z. I think what is important is, what is your intention for the story? What was it that sent this bubbling up for you in the first place? And for me, again, going way, way back, long roots here, it has always been at some level the natural world. Although, I was a city kid. I was born in Delhi. I grew up in Delhi and spent a little time in Pune and then back to Delhi. So we would go back, my father was posted all over the place, and every few years we would be back in Delhi, and then we would be somewhere else. But I was an only child, and books were my friends. And outside somehow became my friend. And there was I remember a banyan tree outside the house in Pune. And actually, when I went back to the city, I went looking for it. And unfortunately, I couldn't recognize even the neighborhood anymore, let alone the tree. But I spent a lot of time up in the branches of that tree with my books. Away from everything, completely oblivious, like the kid on the street. Oblivious to what was around me. So I think that's where that came from. But I think when you write, good writing is about paying attention to what's around you. I think it was Henry James who famously said, be the person on whom nothing is lost, or something like that. And I think that's what I think writers train themselves to be, is to pay attention to small details. And I think observing things in the outdoors is about that. It's about paying attention to small details, and big ones too. Learning to hear when the thunder rolls, learning to pay attention to what's happening in the forest or in the water, or you have to understanding that we're not in control. And so I think those two things are places where writing and the natural world come together very, very easily.
Yeah. In your process of, how did your interest, and because you've mentioned on your website that writing, you have always been a writer, as you've called yourself, right? So if you was to take us through the journey of how did you start writing books, and how did it kind of spread over a large repertoire of genres, for us to say. You have written books on, say, Broken Tusk of Ganesha, to Chachaji's Cup, to different stories. And also, if you could just take us through that thing, it would be wonderful.
So I was a writer as a child, but I didn't know it. I didn't. It wasn't an option. It wasn't anything that I didn't know anybody who was a writer. Nobody in my family wrote books. No one I knew wrote books. And also because of this sort of transient life that I had as a child, I ended up going to English medium schools, and it just never occurred to me that anyone who wasn't, I don't know, English and dead could be a writer, and I knew I wasn't either of those things. So it took me a long time, and it wasn't until my son was born, and he's now 37 and he has two little ones of his own, that's really when it occurred to me that I had always loved children's books and that real life people could write books for children, and that I could maybe hope to do that. It was the time before the internet, and I was home with a small baby, and I every time he'd nap, I would go scribble something off. I didn't know what I was doing, which was really a good thing, because had I known that this was going to be a lifelong commitment, maybe I would have thought twice about doing it, about taking it on. But I knew enough to know that I didn't know how to plot. I didn't know how to construct a story. And so I think that's why I turned to traditional stories to teach me how to write. And I had a very wonderful editor in the US who published The Broken Tusk, and Diantha Thorpe of Linnet Books, which is sadly not in existence anymore. But she said to me at one point, she said, I was writing it was battle scene with demons. It was the Mahishasura Mardini story. And she said, you have to lean into the battle. Why are you holding back? She said, wallow. She said, you need to wallow in the demons. And that was really good advice at many, many levels. So over the years, I've learned to do that. I took a couple of classes, but in the US at the time, and I was living in the States then, the hero's journey was really big. I don't know how much your audience might be aware of this, but it was all Joseph Campbell, and Bill Moyers was interviewing him on TV, and it was all about, how there's a universal story and it's grounded in Jungian theory somehow, and there's this one myth that rules us all. It's very tempting to see the world in such a monodimensional, one-dimensional way. And I always found myself pushing back against that. It's like, wait, not all stories are like that. Some stories are nested. They're contained one within the other. And it's not even about a single person. The person who wrote the story doesn't even have a name. So there's all these various ways of telling a story. Some stories don't have clear beginnings and endings because they belong to this other big web of story that everybody knows. So I always found myself pushing back against that. And I think if you look at the books that I wrote, the picture books are often very slice of life. They are about children doing small things. Monsoon was about rain. And the child in the story is almost a witness and not a character. I have Out of the Way, became one of those that taught me this. It was a story about a boy and a road and a tree and a town, and how he takes one single step and that leads to other steps. And then there's this whole spiral of story that ensues. And that one was rejected by American publishers for I got about 3 or 4 rejections by people whose opinion, I knew and respected. But they kept saying, like, what is this about? Like, who's this story about? And I thought at that time, I don't know. It's about the whole place. And it's about people living in a space where nature also resides. And how do we manage that? It's about a question, maybe. And so but I'm stubborn. And so I kept tinkering with the story. I must admit, I tried to make it a story about a single kid. I gave him a name, and pretty soon people turned up to chop down the tree, and it was horrible. It read like an environmental manifesto, and that's not what I intended to write. And then I sent it to Tulika Press in Chennai, and they said to me, why does it have to be the tree or the road? Why can't it be both? And I thought, oh yeah, that's the story I want to write. So that's what we ended up doing. They published it in English and in 8 Indian languages. So, I mean, I'm so proud and pleased of that book. And I think in a way that was even though Monsoon felt like it was about nature, it was maybe more about the child. But this one really was about place and raised big questions. So that's my journey of how did I come to this. And oh, you need to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So there's one more aspect to that thing. You have been based out of the US and Canada now, and you've been largely also, writing, uh, publishing there in the Americas, so as to say. So how has it been to kind of introduce about the South Asian kind of thematic books in that thing? How has been the reception been for that thing, basically?
It's
Because
been, yeah.
sorry,
Yeah, no, go
because
ahead.
usually you hear from them as, Jungle Book is the one thing that defines everything. Mowgli, Jungle Book, Sher Khan is one thing that defines everything. So in that kind of a scenario, how do how do you place your books?
Yeah, so that I think is the big reason that I actually started writing, because I went looking for books for my kid, and they weren't there. There was the Little Princess and the Secret Garden, and there were, and I would read these. They'd have these passages, and I would think, oh my God, they're talking about the country I was born in, and what they really think it's like that now, and it just made me angry at some level. And then it made me feel like, okay, I've got words, I better use them. And then that was really a big impetus. Somebody said to me, and this became important, it was another thing to remember, is that, and this was from a children's writing class that I took. She said, look, you're trying to write these things that don't exist now, and that's a really good thing. Don't try to, she said, it's like, think of it as a conversation. Think of it as many books in conversation with each other. And if there are gaps in a conversation, you can enter and figure out where your voice is going to fit. So back when I started, there was nobody doing this work. I mean, there were like 4 of us, right? There was Rachna Gilmore in Canada, Rukhsana Khan, also in Canada, Jamila Gavin in England, and Mithali Perkins was there, and there was me. And, I didn't know anybody in the industry. I didn't know anything about this. I just leaped in with both feet, and I guess I got lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, and what was the reception like from, did you face rejections, and did you face some, those kind of?
Yeah, I did. A lot of rejection. I mean, I think publishing is a strange business, right? It's one of these, I can't think of too many other occupations where lifelong relationships can be built on rejection, right? I mean, usually somebody rejects you, you leave, you get away as far from them as you can. But here, I teach students this. Pay attention to those rejection letters. What are they saying? What are they? Look under the skin of those letters. What are they actually saying to you? If there's something that they don't understand about what you're doing, why is that? And how can you make this work in your own way? That's the trick. Because I would get a lot of my rejections in the early years were things like, this is just too complicated for children, or it's children won't understand the cultural context, so you're going to have to. And I wasn't going to explain cultural context. I was going to put a story on the page, and I was determined that I wasn't going to do these things like they would want you to translate. So if you wove an Indian language into the text, which it's natural to do, then they would want like a parallel translation of it in, so that it sounded like the person was talking twice. Well, I wasn't going to do that. So I had to figure out my own way. How do I make this clear in context? Who am I writing for? Am I writing to people who will get this? Am I writing for people who will not get this? Well, the truth is I'm writing for everybody. And so so clarity becomes really important. I did get one review that started, newcomer Krishnaswami, and it went downhill from there. And that was a learning experience too, because I picked that up from in the public library, and the librarian, blessings on her, said to me, she said, look, I'll give you an article that might be helpful to you. And it was Rudine Sims Bishop's seminal article it was called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. and it spoke about the representation of Black people in American children's literature. And it was eye-opening and mind-boggling for me to read that article, because it in effect felt like it was also speaking to me, as a voice representing or influenced by, I would say, I'm not really representing, but influenced by a culture and a way of thinking that that wasn't at the time common in the West. And she said when books are like mirrors, or when children can see themselves reflected in them, and that is really important. They can also be windows where they can open a window for you into a world that you don't know, a world that is unfamiliar, and they can also be sliding glass doors that are invitations to you as a reader to walk in to that world. And I thought that makes so much sense. And I have thought about that very often, and it changed the way that I thought about my own work. So
Yeah, very interesting. And that brings me to my question is, there's a lot of discussion and deliberation on introducing complex themes for young readers. Should we do it in first place? The whole idea of the innocence, and should we be talking complex themes, like for instance climate change or global warming? And if we are to do that, how do we really do that? What is the approach that we should say? Where do you weigh in on this one?
I think I think we underestimate children when we try to protect them from complexities in the world. Children live in the world that we live in. They are not blind to it. They certainly feel its effects. Are children not going to be swept away by floodwaters as every bit as much as adults, perhaps even more? They're more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, if we just look at that, but also war. You look at what does war do to children? What does international conflict do to children? What are we, we have created this world, and then to say, well, we want you to grow up into this world that we have created, which in many ways really stinks, and yet we're not going to tell you about it because we think we ought to take care of you. I mean, we're not doing very good caretaking if that is the case. So I think that the other wonderful thing about reading and books is that when you are not ready to hear something in a book, you will not hear it. As a child, I didn't have very many books. I didn't have access to very many books. My mother would, my parents would do their best. They would buy me stuff. But essentially, I read everything there was in the house. I read many times, including books that I absolutely was not ready for, novels that I was reading at 10 that I should have been reading at 15, but I didn't get them. I didn't understand them. It was not until I reread them many years later that I was going, oh, that's what they were doing. So I think that we owe it to children to speak the truth in books. We can do this in ways that are respectful of where children are and what they understand. But kids are not stupid. They get what's going on.
Yeah. So that there's a related question that one of our viewers, Akanksha, has asked. How important is it for you to revisit your childhood in the process of writing books for children?
It's essential, because you are the only child that you can really know. I mean, you can have children and you will know them, but I mean, anybody who has a child knows that there are ways in which you know your child, and there are ways in which you absolutely don't know your child. That child will become his or her own person, and that person is different from us. So in a way, the only mind you have is yours, and the only childhood you can really go dip into for emotional resonance is your own. And I think that the more you do that, the more you understand yourself, and the more you are able to do this in an unsentimental way. And I think that is really important to do, to not to look at childhood the way most adults look back on childhood, and they either, if they have had difficult childhoods, they just try not to think about them, or they deal with them in their own way. And if they had reasonably ordinary ones, they kind of rose tint them and think back with nostalgia to the elements of childhood. And I think it's really important not to do that. That it's, if you look at children in an unsentimental way, you will learn to look at your own childhood in a truthful way as well.
Fascinating. And just a addition to that thing, is there when you're writing a book, when you're kind of weaving together a narrative, are you thinking about a reader, and if a particular thing, who this would be suited for, what is it that elements of this book that they're gonna write, or is there something as an author, the reader is at the back of your mind?
So audience, not in an early draft. So I try to deliberately, when I don't even know what a story is, because I don't outline and plot. I tend to just take the kid on the sidewalk and start writing, and start imagining, who she might be and what she might be doing. And I will take, I always start out longhand, and I will take a notebook and write, something like that, and just start writing. And I'll sometimes even do really silly things, like take different colored inks and begin writing the questions that I have about the story. So it is important to me at that stage not to worry about the audience. Now, when you are revising and you're thinking about what this thing is going to be, is it a short story, is it a poem, is it a novel, is it a picture book, then you do have to start thinking about the audience. You have to think about the age range. I mean, when you write, and this is what's different about writing for children, because when we write for adults, we don't think about an age range necessarily. We don't say this is going to be, you can sort of speak to yourself almost. But when you write for kids, because of the way the market is set up, you do have to take that into consideration. Like, how old is this kid who's going to read this thing, and what's it going to mean to them? But that said, I think beyond the form, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about potential audience. I think that if you do that too early, it can really restrict the work. And the other thing is, truthfully, I don't always know what this is going to be. I mean, I thought my book about Mount Everest was going to be 22 poems about the mountain, everything from the geology of the land and the upthrust of the range to this little spider that lives above the tree line and only eats the Himalayan jumping spider, and it only eats whatever's blown up on the wind. I thought I was just in love with the facts behind these poems. They were mind-boggling. Bar-headed geese that fly high over the mountains, that sort of thing. So I wrote 22 poems. I actually wrote more like 26, and I thought, okay, 22 are going to go into the book, and it got rejected everywhere. It was just like, it was not hanging together. And then finally Groundwood in Canada picked it up, but they said, we're going to do a picture book if you will just use one poem, and it's the one in two voices about Norgay and Hillary climbing the mountain, and how their lives came into contact, and everything else. Take everything else in the poems and turn them into prose, and they will become back matter. So in the process, alas, the Himalayan jumping spider had to go because there just wasn't room for it. But I don't always know, and sometimes you have to follow the story. And then the audience is the last thing you're thinking of. You're just trying to make sense of this thing that's shown up in your head in a big tumbled mess, and you have to sort it out, because what's the point of writing something if it doesn't get read?
The fascinating thing is this 21 poems still somewhere there on the hard drive or a notebook,
There
waiting to see the
are,
light of day.
and I'm going to show you one. Hang on. So I did a school presentation at a library, and I did a library presentation in Colorado. And I told them the story about how I wrote the 22 poems, and and then I put one up on my slideshow. And the librarian said, she said, my son is an artist, and he's in love with ammonites, the shaligram fossils. So I gave her this poem, and her son illustrated it, and so here it is.
Fascinating. That's
So
so beautiful.
it's an acrostic. It's an acrostic poem with ammonites spelt on the side. And
Yeah.
of course, that's where that came from. So yeah, and you never know. So this one has sort of found another little life of its own. Um,
Fascinating. Yeah. So coming back to the whole your thing as a writer, is there a writing process that you have? Like lot of authors in the past, including Ruskin Bond, they spoke about the idea of disciplined writing, and
yeah.
the discipline is essential. So is there a routine that you follow? Is there a process that you have? And
It's like exercise. If you don't use those muscles, you will start to feel the loss. And I try. I really I need to write every not always every day, but at least a few times a week. And often when I'm in the middle of a project, it will be all the time, every day, many times a day. And with yeah, I just get very bad tempered if I don't write. If I've got something that I need to write, I get very grumpy. So my family has learned over the years to stay out of my way. Um, but it is important to have a regular system, a regular way. I block my calendar out for writing time. I treat those as appointments that I need to keep. I turn off everything else. I turn off notifications. I turn off my phone, and I get to work when I get to work. Um, it's very easy to get distracted when you're writing in your home. There are a million things to do that can easily drag you away. And I've learned over the years to say, well, no, I'll make a truce with the dust. We will eat what we're going to eat, and I gotta do this thing.
And also the thing is, how about journaling? A lot of people have also spoken about having a small book of ideas, which they ideas keep popping in their heads, and they're collecting that. So is that something that you do
Yeah,
as?
I do, but I don't. It's not systematic. I don't date them. In fact, I like it when it's messy and not organized. I think that there's a stage at which I need to organize my work, and it's usually when I'm about halfway through something. Then I have to step back and think, what's this really about? Is there a timeline to it? Is there, if it's fiction, then I have to start thinking about scenes and sequence and things like that for a novel. But when in the beginning, when it's just ideas, I literally just I grab the notebook and I just scribble, and then I put it away, and I don't go back to it until the next urge hits to do that. And I start in longhand. I think it works better for me. I usually can't finish in longhand because I have a terrible handwriting, and sometimes I can't read what I've written. So when I'm thinking so fast that I just need to grab it and put it down, then I go to the keyboard and I open a file and I start to think about this in a more systematic way. But the interplay between that and this is important. I think I see there are two aspects to being. There are two kinds of mindset that you need to cultivate, right? There's the sort of reasonable managerial mindset where you organize stuff and you think, okay, what am I really trying to do here? How much time is this going to take? What is this really about? Is there a logic to it? Does it make any sense? And then there's the other kind of bursting out of nowhere thing that comes when you get an idea. And you think, well, what does this really mean to me? What is important about this? Can I bear to live with this for a couple of years, as I said before? So those, you just have to balance those two. You have to sometimes, when your creative self is in charge, you have to get out of the way. You just have to write the stuff that shows up in your head and not worry about who's going to read it, what's it going to be. You just write it, and then you go back to the writing and you think, okay, what have I just said? What does this really mean? Is there something here that's going to sustain multiple readings, say, for a picture book, which is what you want. You want the child to be able to go back to the book over and over again. You want the parent to be able to stand reading it 50 times over. That kind of thing. So there is a process. It's rather loose, and it's messy. And I have learned to embrace the mess. I used to try to organize, and I realized that you can organize the life out of something. And I need to, when I'm in that messy phase, I need to not let myself organize the work or think about it logically. I just need to come at it from an emotional perspective.
Fascinating. Just one thing, Uma, before a couple of, I know there's so many things to ask you, but as a writer, I've heard a lot of people say that they go through these phases when when they're writing something and they find it abhorrable in that sense. They are most critical about it themselves. And there is a difficult journey that they have to make to kind of overcome that their self-depreciation in that sense, that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
As an author, have you gone through this, and how do you do that?
Yeah, it's that inner critic. It's the inner critic, right? Everybody's got one. We all had one as children, and we have an inner critic as an adult. We have learned to cultivate that in ourselves. I think, again, it's that dual mind. When you're drafting, you send the inner critic away. You put her in another room, or you put him on a plane and send him off on a vacation. And then you need that critic. Yeah, right? You need the critic when you are revising, when you are trying to make sense of the work. You need that logical mind to come back and say, wait a minute, what are you really trying to do here? Do you really need that scene? What's going on with this? And you need to train your critic to ask questions instead of deliver answers or instructions. And that's the hard part, because if you give in to it, then you're never going to get anything done. But if you don't have it, then you're going to end up with a red hot mess that no one else is going to make any sense of. So it's not that that voice is a bad thing. It's that it needs to be used at certain times in the life of a work. And then you need to tame it and make it do what you want to do. And actually, maybe not even so much what you want to do, but what the story wants to do. So I think that's my way of getting around it, is by saying, look, we're all of the voices in me are serving this story. And this story is now something other than me. Now I've got a draft to work with. So once you have that, then you have a story that you can consider as being outside yourself. And then it's a lot easier to handle your internal voices the way the story needs. Right?
I wanted to touch one more thing that you have mentioned is, you have spoken about the fact that you have faced rejections for your submissions and, those kind of things. So a lot of young authors and a lot of things, it takes a hit on their own self-esteem. How do you bounce back from something like that? How do you?
Every time it takes a hit, not only as a young person, it even now, I get rejected, I get upset. They don't get it. I thought I'd done this so well. They don't get it. But years ago, I wrote, I had got a series of rejection letters, and some of them were nice. Some of them were like, dear contributor. So I wrote a rejection letter in response to rejection letters, and you'll see it on my website. And essentially, and I sent it off to the SCBWI, which is the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I sent it off to their. We were publishing a print bulletin at that time. and they published it. So I thought, then that made me feel a lot better, because essentially it was like, dear editor, I'm, thank you for your rejection letter. I've read it very thoroughly, but I simply, I have to regret that I must find myself rejecting it. It is simply not right for my collection. And so, I wish you luck with other rejection letters that you write to other authors, that sort of thing. So I think you have to laugh it off. You cannot take it personally. It is, they are doing a job. They are trying to survive in a business, and they have their own priorities and expectations. And so you have to go back and look at the story and serve the story. But yeah, it's not easy. Even editorial letters, right? You get these. When I was doing the book on, it wasn't to do with nature writing. It was Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Threads of Peace, and I got a 17-page editorial letter, and it had one big paragraph of very nice things that she said about it, and the rest of it was all stuff that I needed to work on. So I went through and I highlighted the very nice things. I marked them up for myself, and I put that letter on my desk. And every time I would get bogged down in all of the work, I would go back and look at the very nice things that she'd said. So I think you gather the praise where you can, and then you think about what out of that really resonates for you, and you tell yourself, yes, this is true. And then the other things are also true. The questions that people are asking, the questions that I'm asking about my own work, that is also true. So kind of like Rini on the rooftop in, looking for a bird and thinking about her mother's calling her, and the bird is calling to her, and she's seen this little glimpse. So the story is like this little glimpse of iridescence in that you spot, and you're chasing it. You're trying to figure it out, and everything that everybody else is telling you may matter, but not in that moment.
Fascinating. And coming to the birds on the brain and the book itself, there's also this aspect I wanted to ask you is about the kind of research that goes into a book, because this book is essentially on birds per se, bird count, yeah, right? So are you a birder yourself, or how did this come across to you? This idea of writing a book on birds?
So in a way, this book made me a birder. I in book one, there was a throwaway line, right? There was this line about Rini, and it said she was a secondary character, and there was one line there that said she was where Yasmin says, my friend Rini is a wild girl. She is wild about movies and about all wild things. And that's all there was really about Rini's character in terms of any kind of hook that I could use for book two. And so I started thinking about that. And then I started thinking about, when my son was little, his interests would change from one week to the next. One week it was dinosaurs, the next week it was something else. And I thought, yeah, kids are like that. They try on different roles, right? To see what's going to fit. And so I started thinking, what could Rini be wild about? And I wrote that scene on the rooftop, and I didn't know. I didn't know at the time. So I wrote to find out, really. Most of the time, when I write things that feel like openings, they don't end up being openings. I end up throwing them away. The story really tends to begin much later, maybe 2 or 3 chapters into what I think is the beginning. But this ended up being the opening scene in the book. And I mean, literally, I was writing this, and a bird flew in, and and into the scene, landed on the page with a glimmer of iridescent feathers, and I knew, right? And I knew that's what she was interested in. And then my editor said, "So how'd this change? Like, what did this? How did Rini become so wild about birds when in the first book, which you say happens just months before, we didn't know that?" And I thought, okay, I guess I have to find a way to explain it. So this is what I did. On the bus to school, I tell Yasmin how I almost spotted a sunbird. She looks up from her book, she is always reading, to listen. I tell her how a sunbird's feathers shine in the sunlight, changing from black to blue, with hints of purple and magenta like a shimmery silk sari in a movie. I used to be wild about movies and all wildlife, all wildlife. But ever since I saw a whole flock of parrots on the rooftop, all of that changed. I decided there's only enough time to be wild about one thing. So now it's birds, birds, birds. So that's how that happened. And so then, of course, I had been an sort of occasional recreational birder. I had downloaded the Merlin app and the eBird app. I had put in even a few lists from different places, including some from Indian visits to India. But now with this book on my hands, I became serious about this. And in fact, when I was in Chennai, while I was writing the book, I used the Merlin app, and I logged into eBird, and I submitted my lists as if I were Rini, thinking, what would she look for? What would she, if somebody gave her a phone for a day and said, go do this, how would she go about it? I spent a few days doing that, and it was really instructive. So that was my research, really. And lots of other, it was really using the Cornell ornithology website is just awesome. And I always think that when you're writing about a particular thing, so in book 3, mangroves become an issue. And so then I had to end up doing quite a lot of reading on what's happening to mangroves with climate change and how they're migrating in some instances. The mangrove forests are actually, the trees are reseeding in places that they couldn't live before. And what that's doing. So, and what all lives in a mangrove forest. And then, so you do have to, but I can get lost in research. So the trick is to do just enough to inform the story and then get out of research mode, because otherwise I would spend my whole life in the library reading stuff or online reading stuff and figuring out, all kinds of wonderful work which means I'll never write the book. So.
Yeah, and one of the things that I particularly liked about your book is, while you kind of, you touched upon the Campbell's hero's journey per se, Rini itself goes through a journey of her, when she starts off, she's a pakka environmentalist, as you might, if you were to use the word. But towards, as she goes through this thing, she realizes that there's a lot of accommodation, a give and take, which is also very required. So this journey of Rini was very fascinating in that sense. So is that something that you particularly designed, and was it a commentary on the way the environmental movement kind of factors out in most of our real life?
I think, yeah, in a way, Yasmin does that in book 1 too, right? Where she's so focused on, she's going to read a book every day for the rest of her life. And then when this thing happens, she has to take her nose out of her book and do something. So the very thing that she loved is now threatened. And then, so she has to stop doing that in order to relate to the world. So I think it's more about, that I'm writing a community and that the child becomes aware of it. And maybe that's in a sense that I think happens in all 3 books, that the kids, each of the children realizes that they are a part of something bigger than themselves. And that something has many layers. It's about neighborhood and family and friends and friendship, and what does that call for, and then just learning to be a human being in the world, which is, sometimes you get angry about things and sometimes you long to fix them, and then sometimes you just have to take very small steps. So no, you can't think about all this when you're writing, though, because when you're writing, it's about, okay, so if the feathers are too dark, they're too small for a myna, smaller than a sparrow, what's she going to do with this? And then her mother's calling her. So what happens after that? And what day of the week is it? So time is my big challenge is always time. Time and I have a very fraught relationship. Copy editors always catch me, and I 2 Tuesdays in a row, and nothing happens in between. So things like that.
Yeah, but I must compliment you. There's some very nice metaphors within the book that really kind of go with, like the hands that go up like tree branches, or ideas that fly like city pigeons. In that sense, that's very interesting. Bits of phraseology that you've used. I also wanted to touch upon one thing. Is usually when we think of nature books, we think of the idea is pristine nature, forests, jungles, and anything. While your book is on nature, it's very much based in the urban thing that we have, and that's very interesting because there's a lot of interactions that we kind of overlook in our day-to-day life, yearning for the big things that we'll do at some time later. So that aspect of nature writing, is there something that you feel is the most relevant thing, given the fact that there's a massive urbanization happening and most of our population is going to live in the cities in the coming times? So this connection with nature will be more of an urban one than the ones that we kind of fantasize and think about it.
Yeah, I think fantasize is the operative word, because in a sense, this so-called pristine environment that we talk about, that's a Victorian construct. It's the notion that, how did they ever find pristine environments? They threw people out of them. Right? I mean, this happens with wildlife preserves. It happens in nature reserves in North America. It happened with European forest areas in northern Europe. So the notion of a pristine environment, in a way, that itself is problematic, because people have always been managing their natural environments. I mean, since not even since agriculture, but before that, even when our very remote ancestors were hunters and gatherers, they were managing the forest. They were, or the plains, or the prairies, or whatever, grassland, whatever it was. They were taking what they needed and putting their stamp on it. So that itself is a problem. And so therefore, we have to stop thinking of ourselves as apart from nature. We're part of it. We're doing things to the environment, and we are being changed by the environment. We are shaped by it, and we shape it. And that is regardless of whether you are in a rural area or an urban one. And as we see, the distinctions between those two are being blurred more and more. You look at the exurbs of cities and how the city is sort of spreading out and all over. And then there are questions about farmland is another way that we go into wild areas. But there is no such thing as a pristine environment. And that's not just anymore. I think it was always so at some level. But for me, it's important to write stories that put kids where kids are, and a lot of kids are in urban areas. So, and then I wanted to. There's a charm to the bustle of Indian cities, and I wanted to see if I could capture that. The big neighborhood bustle of everybody knowing everybody else and being in everyone's business. That is just quite wonderful. And I wanted to capture that sense of an apartment building. I also, quite truthfully, wanted to capture a world in which 3 children from families with different religious and ethnic and linguistic traditions could be friends. And that's another world that may be in danger of disappearing. So.
Yeah. So, just a couple of final things. I wanted your take on the fact that you mentioned earlier to me that you won't call yourself a nature writer per se, right? But now, would you say that since writing this thing and the fact that there are so many issues regarding environment and nature, is this something that you want to consciously pursue and now include thematic bits about nature in your book, or from something that you were doing rather subconsciously earlier to doing it consciously now?
I think so. I think so. I think that it's almost hard for me to now think of a story that doesn't involve some thread related to the natural world. And I can see how I can see now, looking back at my work, how that's sort of evolved over time. Whether it's, I've got a picture book about the night sky and light pollution in urban areas. So I think it's always been there. I just haven't been aware of it as something to pay attention to. And maybe I will do that more consciously now, which is actually thanks to you.
Okay, fascinating. Uma, just there's one question that often gets asked, and that's kind of writing as a career. A lot of young people can they make a living out of writing books? So your take on this, especially now, because you are also working in an international market per se. Books are much more available on a global scale. So I just wanted your take on opportunities for young writers, and what would your message be to them?
I think that if you are driven to write, you should do that. I think that it's hard to make a living as a writer. It's a very competitive world. You have to cultivate your creative self, and then you have to cultivate this business self. Sometimes it's a matter of, but there are many ways of doing this. Sometimes, I have chosen to teach, and teaching in a way sort of bought me time to write. I did other things for a while. I was a counselor before that. I managed a grant for a university. So I did things that would, I realize now, looking back, that what I was doing was just buying time to write. So if you really are serious about this, and you will know if you can stand all the rejection, and you can stand, just throwing away lots of stuff that you've done, which also happens. You write lots and lots of pages, and then you throw them away, and then you start over, or you take one little thread from 50 pages that you wrote, and that becomes the story. So it's a business. If you can stand to revisit the same thought for many years on end, sometimes, or at least very intensively for a short period of time, whatever the work takes. If that speaks to you, then you should do it. But it's almost like a test. Can you stand all the messiness of it? Can you stand the rejection? Can you stand all these other things that come with the business? And then there are ways to make this happen. Most of the writers I know are, even those who write, a good chunk of the time, maybe even full time, they're doing something else. They're doing school visits, or they're teaching, or they're doing some other kind of writing, or they've just got day jobs that help support this business. And then you see, after a while, with many books, I find that I no longer need to do other things, but it changes, and the marketplace changes. So you have to be able to juggle a lot of things to make it happen. But if you're driven to it, nothing's going to stop you.
Yeah, that I was gonna ask for a kind of a message or a tip. I think so there cannot be a better one than the one that you've given for.
And I can't imagine doing anything else. I mean, I can't imagine that. I felt every other job I ever had, I felt like I was play acting. I was on the fringes. I wasn't really part of that community. And then I arrived into writing, and I felt as if I'd come home. So
Fascinating. Just final take is on a website, and I'm hoping a lot of people who want to get in touch with you can get in touch with you through your website as well. So there's a beautiful thing about the geckos, the lizards, yeah. So that's a fascinating thing. And can we see something around geckos in one of your works in the future?
I hope so. I've been trying to work them in, and I haven't been able to do that so far, but I'm sure I will. It will show up at some point. But yes, I was so afraid of them. I was convinced they were going to fall on my head and die, and it never happened. And there they were, and they are so fascinating. So yes.
Wonderful. So on that note, thank you so much, Uma, for your time. And I know it's very early morning, and so a bigger thank you in that sense for for joining us from all the way from Canada. And it's been wonderful talking to you. Lot many interesting things, and I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot of ideas and resilience from listening to your talk on how to get through the whole process of writing per se.
Shashwat, thank you so much. It has been a wonderful conversation, and it's really my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And to all our viewers, we'll meet again next month. So till then, bye-bye. Thank you.